Wolves attack a helpless puppy. Then something shocking happens. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made even the trees seem like they were holding their breath. A thick fog curled around the base of the towering pines, swallowing the moonlight and casting the world into an endless stretch of darkness. The only sound was the faint rustling of dry leaves as a small, fragile creature shivered beneath a fallen tree branch. A tiny, helpless puppy, no more than a few weeks old, lay curled in the dirt. Its fur was matted with mud, its ribs faintly visible beneath its soft coat. Its tiny body trembled violently, not just from the biting cold, but from the sheer exhaustion of trying to survive. Its mother was nowhere to be found. It had been alone for what felt like forever. The puppy let out a weak, whimpering cry, but the wind quickly swallowed the sound. No one was coming. No one even knew it was here, or so it thought. A branch snapped in the distance. Then another. Something was moving in the darkness. The puppy lifted its tiny head, ears twitching. A low, menacing growl rumbled through the air, followed by the sound of multiple sets of paws crunching over dead leaves. Yellow eyes appeared between the trees, first one pair, then another, then four, then six. A pack of wolves had caught its scent. The leader of the pack, a massive, scarred wolf with cold, merciless eyes, stepped forward. His breath was visible in the cold air, slow and steady, as if he had all the time in the world. He lowered his head, sniffing the ground, his gaze locked onto the defenseless creature in front of him. The puppy froze. Its heartbeat hammered against its tiny chest, its little paws digging into the dirt as if it wanted to disappear into the ground. It let out a soft, desperate whimper, one last cry for help. The wolves inched closer. One more step, then another, then, boom! A loud crack of wood shattered the silence. A sudden roar of a human voice ripped through the night. "Hey! Get away from it!" The wolves stopped in their tracks, their ears snapping up. The massive alpha snarled, turning its head toward the sound. From the darkness, a figure emerged. A man, tall and breathless, gripping a thick tree branch like a weapon. His chest heaved from running, his eyes locked onto the scene in front of him. The puppy blinked, barely able to process what was happening. For the first time, it wasn't alone. Ethan's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he crouched low behind a thick tree trunk, his heart hammering so loudly he feared the wolves might hear it. The dense forest stretched around him in every direction, its towering pines swaying slightly in the cold evening breeze. The air was thick with tension, filled only with the distant howling of wolves and the terrified whimpers of the tiny puppy trapped just a few feet away. The scene before him sent a chill down his spine. The helpless little creature, no older than a few weeks, lay shivering on the damp forest floor, its white fur matted with dirt. It was barely breathing, its tiny body curled up in a desperate attempt to protect itself. Surrounding it, just beyond the flickering light of the setting sun, were three massive wolves. Their yellow eyes glowed with hunger, their powerful bodies tense as they inched closer to their prey. Ethan had encountered wild animals before during his hikes, but this was different. This wasn't just a casual sighting of wildlife. This was a life-or-death moment, and every passing second pushed the puppy closer to the inevitable. He clenched his fists. He had to act fast. But how? He had no weapons, no gun, no knife. The only thing he could find nearby was a thick, sturdy tree branch lying beside his boot. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He reached for it cautiously, his fingers wrapping tightly around the rough wood. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. Should he scream and try to scare them away? No, that might just provoke them. Should he throw something and distract them? Maybe. But what if they didn't take the bait? His options were limited, and time was running out. The alpha wolf, a massive beast with jet-black fur and scarred ears, let out a low, guttural growl. The other wolves responded instantly, their muscles rippling beneath their thick coats as they prepared to strike. Ethan's grip on the branch tightened. It was now or never. With a sudden burst of movement, he slammed the branch against a nearby tree with all his strength. Crack! The sharp sound echoed through the forest like a gunshot. Birds scattered from the treetops, their wings flapping wildly against the darkening sky. The wolves flinched, their heads snapping toward the noise. For a brief moment they hesitated, and that was all Ethan needed. He ran. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he sprinted toward the puppy, his boots crunching against fallen leaves. The wolves reacted instantly, their hesitation evaporating as they lunged forward. Ethan barely had time to react. One wolf snarled and pounced. With every ounce of strength, Ethan swung the branch like a baseball bat. The impact sent the wolf sprawling to the side with a startled yelp. But there was no time to celebrate. The alpha was already closing in. Ethan dove forward, scooping the trembling puppy into his arms. The poor thing was barely conscious, its tiny chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. Then pain. A burning sensation tore through his left arm as one of the wolf's claws raked across his skin. Ethan gritted his teeth, ignoring the fiery sting. He couldn't stop now. He turned and bolted into the trees. The wolves were right behind him, their powerful legs propelling them forward with terrifying speed. Ethan dodged through the trees, leaping over roots and fallen branches as he ran faster than he ever had before. The forest was against him. Thorny bushes snagged at his jacket. Loose rocks made every step treacherous. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the puppy's tiny heartbeat fluttered against his chest. A snarl rang out behind him, too close. Ethan took a desperate risk. Up ahead, a massive fallen tree blocked the path. It was at least 4 feet high, thick with moss and decay. It was his only chance. With a final, explosive burst of energy, he leaped, just as the alpha's jaws snapped shut where his leg had been a second earlier. Ethan hit the ground hard, rolling over the damp earth as he landed. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, but he forced himself up. He turned just in time to see the wolves skid to a halt in front of the fallen tree. The alpha paced angrily, his yellow eyes locked onto Ethan. The other wolves growled, but none dared to jump over the massive obstacle. Ethan took a shaky breath, tightening his arms around the puppy. They were safe. For now. The wolves lingered for a moment, their frustration clear. But after a few tense seconds, the alpha let out a sharp, commanding bark, and just like that, the pack turned and disappeared into the trees. Ethan didn't move for a long time, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. His arm throbbed from the deep scratch, his breathing ragged. But despite everything, he had won. Slowly, he looked down at the tiny creature in his arms. The puppy's big, dark eyes stared up at him, filled with confusion and exhaustion. It was so small, its fragile body barely the size of his forearm. Its tiny paws twitched weakly, as if it was trying to understand what had just happened. A wave of emotion crashed over Ethan. He had come out here to escape the world, to be alone with his thoughts. But now, in the middle of the wilderness, he had risked his life for this tiny, helpless soul. Why? He didn't know. But as the puppy let out a small, grateful whimper and nestled deeper into his chest, Ethan felt something shift inside him. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was the puppy. With a deep, shaky breath, Ethan rose to his feet. He still had a long journey ahead. The forest was vast, and night was falling fast. But now, as he held the tiny life in his hands, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just walking back to his cabin. He was taking this puppy home. Ethan trudged through the thick underbrush, his body aching from exhaustion and pain. The deep scratch on his arm burned with every movement, but he hardly noticed it anymore. His mind was too fixated on the fragile life he carried against his chest. The puppy had stopped whimpering, though Ethan wasn't sure if that was a good sign. It lay still in his arms, its tiny body rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. He could feel the rapid thump of its heart, its warmth barely noticeable against the chilling night air. The cabin was still miles away. The wolves had forced him to take a longer, more treacherous path home, avoiding their hunting grounds. Every step was slow, his boots crunching over frost-laden leaves, his muscles screaming for rest. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. The weight of the puppy in his arms was more than just physical. It carried a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in a long time. As he walked, memories flickered through his mind. Ghosts of a past he had spent years trying to bury. A time when he had held something just as fragile. Something he had lost. The wind howled through the trees, biting at his exposed skin. He adjusted his grip on the puppy, tucking it closer to his body, shielding it from the cold. "You gotta hang in there, little one," he muttered, his voice barely more than a breath. The puppy didn't respond. Ethan pushed forward, forcing himself to move faster. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he refused to slow down. Every minute mattered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the silhouette of his cabin appeared through the trees. Relief flooded his chest. He wasn't sure if he would make it, but somehow he had. The small wooden structure sat at the edge of a frozen lake, nestled between towering pines. Smoke still curled from the chimney. He had left the fire burning when he stormed off earlier that day. Now he was grateful for it. He reached the front steps, fumbled for the handle with his numb fingers, and pushed the door open. The warmth hit him like a wave, chasing the chill from his bones. He wasted no time. He grabbed an old blanket from the couch and wrapped the puppy up tightly, placing it near the fire. The little creature still didn't move. Ethan's heart clenched. He dropped to his knees beside it, placing a careful hand against its tiny chest. It was breathing, but barely. "You're not giving up on me," he whispered, more to himself than the pup. He rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a small bowl and filling it with lukewarm water. He dipped his fingers in and gently touched them to the puppy's dry nose, hoping to get some response. Nothing. His pulse quickened. He had risked his life for this little thing. He couldn't lose it now. Ethan ran a trembling hand through his damp hair, his thoughts racing. There had to be something else he could do. Then an idea. He grabbed an old flannel shirt from the chair, wrapping it around himself before pulling the puppy into his arms again. If the fire wasn't enough, maybe his body heat would be. Time passed in silence. Minutes, maybe an hour. Ethan sat there, unmoving, the tiny pup cradled against his chest. He listened to the crackling fire, his breathing slow and steady, his heart still pounding with lingering adrenaline. Then, a soft, tiny whimper, his breath caught. He looked down just in time to see the puppy shift slightly, its small head pressing against his chest, seeking warmth. A sound escaped Ethan's throat, something between a laugh and a sigh of relief. "You're a stubborn one, huh?" he murmured, his voice softer than he expected. The puppy didn't answer, but it didn't have to. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something stir deep within him. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Something he had thought was gone forever. Morning came slowly, filtering through the frost-covered windows. Ethan barely slept. He had stayed on the floor all night, the puppy curled up in his flannel shirt, rising and falling with steady breaths. Now, as the sun cast golden rays through the trees, he watched the tiny creature stir. It stretched its little legs and blinked up at him, confused, but alive. Ethan smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Guess we're stuck with each other now," he said, scratching the pup's tiny head. The puppy let out a small yawn and nestled closer. Ethan let out a deep breath, staring into the fire. Maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what he needed. Ethan sat on the floor, his back against the couch, watching the tiny puppy sleep soundly in the bundle of blankets. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a soft, flickering light across the cabin. He hadn't moved all night, afraid that if he did, the fragile creature might slip away. But now, as the morning sun crept through the frosted window panes, warmth filled the room in more ways than one. The little pup stirred, letting out a small yawn before blinking up at Ethan with wide, curious eyes. For the first time since he had carried the trembling bundle through the dark woods, he truly allowed himself to believe that the pup was going to make it. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured with a small smirk. The puppy gave a tiny whimper in response, stretching its weak limbs before curling up again. Something inside Ethan shifted. It had been years since he had let anyone in. Out here in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and ghosts of the past, he had convinced himself that solitude was the only way forward, that the world had taken enough from him. But now, looking at the helpless creature that had somehow survived against all odds, he felt something unfamiliar. Purpose. Determined to help the puppy regain its strength, Ethan carefully prepared a small bowl of milk mixed with warm water. He dipped his fingers into the liquid and gently touched them to the pup's tiny mouth. First, there was no response. Then, slowly, the puppy's little pink tongue flicked out, lapping up the drops. Ethan grinned for the first time in years. "That's it," he whispered, his voice softer than he ever remembered it being. "You're a fighter." He guided the pup's mouth toward the bowl, watching as it struggled but eventually managed to drink on its own. It was weak, its movements shaky, but Ethan could see the determination in its tiny body, the same determination that had somehow kept it alive. As the morning stretched on, Ethan made a makeshift bed by the fireplace, layering soft blankets and an old sweater of his. The pup, though still exhausted, seemed more alert, its small tail giving the tiniest wag when Ethan scratched behind its ears. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this, needed something to care for, something to fight for. Over the next few days, Ethan nursed the pup back to health. He fed it carefully, kept it warm, and made sure it never felt alone. At night, he would wake up at the smallest sound, checking to make sure it was still breathing. It wasn't long before the pup's personality started to shine through. It was stubborn, refusing to stay in the blankets Ethan had set up. More than once, he woke up to find it curled beside him instead. It was curious, waddling across the wooden floor on unsteady legs, sniffing at everything in sight. And it was brave, far braver than Ethan would have expected from such a small, fragile creature. One morning, Ethan opened the door to fetch firewood, and before he could react, the puppy bolted outside, tumbling into the snow. "Hey!" Ethan called, startled. But the pup didn't seem to care. It stumbled and flopped, yipping excitedly as it attempted to chase its own tail. Ethan shook his head, laughing for the first time in what felt like forever. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he muttered, stepping outside and scooping the tiny troublemaker into his arms. The pup licked his chin, and just like that, Ethan knew. This wasn't temporary. This little soul, once abandoned and left for dead, had found its way to him for a reason. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel so alone. As the days passed, the puppy grew stronger. Its once weak legs carried it fearlessly across the cabin, and its eyes, once dull and tired, now gleamed with curiosity and mischief. Ethan realized something: he had never given it a name. "You need something that fits you," he mused one evening, watching the pup clumsily pounce on a loose thread of his sweater. A memory stirred in the back of his mind. A voice, soft, warm, long gone. "Brave doesn't always mean big." His breath caught. He pushed the thought away before it could sting too much, but the words remained. "Bran," he said aloud. The puppy's ears perked up. Ethan smirked. "Bran it is, then." The name felt right. And as the pup, Bran, curled up beside him that night, Ethan knew that this wasn't just the puppy's second chance. It was his too. Days turned into weeks, and Bran was no longer the fragile, helpless pup Ethan had once carried through the snow. He was stronger now, playful and full of life. The once silent cabin had transformed into something different, something warmer. Ethan had stopped talking to ghosts and started talking to Bran instead. But just when everything seemed to be falling into place, something strange happened. It started with the wolves. Ethan had spent years in the wilderness. He knew the habits of every creature that roamed these woods. And wolves? They never lingered this long. But for the past few nights, they had. He could hear them, low, guttural howls in the distance, closer than before. He had seen their glowing eyes in the treeline, watching, waiting. At first, he thought it was just chance. But then Bran started acting differently. The pup, once eager to explore the forest's edge, refused to go near it now. He stayed close to Ethan's side, ears flattened, body tense. When the wolves howled, Bran would let out a soft whimper, curling up by Ethan's feet as if seeking protection. Ethan didn't like it. Something wasn't right. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the mountains, Ethan heard something unusual. Not a howl, not the wind, but movement. Something was outside the cabin. Ethan grabbed the rifle he kept by the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold air bit at his skin as he scanned the treeline. The forest was silent, too silent. Then a flash of movement. A shadow shifted among the trees. Eyes, many of them, glowing like embers in the darkness. The wolves. They weren't attacking. They weren't hunting. They were waiting. For what? His heart pounded. He was about to step back inside when Bran suddenly let out a deep, trembling growl. Ethan turned. Bran was standing at the doorway, fur bristling, his small frame tense with fear. And then Ethan saw it. Something was hanging from Bran's collar. He had never noticed it before. It had been buried under thick fur, hidden when Bran had been too weak to move. But now, as Bran lifted his head, the metal tag glinted in the firelight. Ethan knelt down, carefully turning the tag over in his fingers. His breath caught in his throat. There was a name that wasn't Bran's, and an address, one that didn't belong to him. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. It was the symbol carved into the back of the tag. A mark, a deep, deliberate engraving. One that Ethan had seen before, years ago, on the remains of an old campsite, on the wreckage of a cabin that had burned to the ground, and on a warning sign, a sign left by those who had lived here before him. A sign that said, "Stay away from the wolves. They are not what they seem." Ethan's hands shook as he looked from the tag to Bran, then back at the wolves waiting in the trees. This wasn't just a lost puppy. This wasn't just a lucky rescue. The wolves hadn't been hunting him that night. They had been trying to take him back. But why? And who or what had Bran truly belonged to before Ethan found him? The wolves howled again, a low, mournful cry that sent a chill through Ethan's bones. Bran whimpered, pressing close to Ethan's side. And for the first time since he had brought the pup home, Ethan wasn't sure if Bran had been saved or stolen. What do you think really happened that night in the forest? Were the wolves trying to harm Bran? Or were they trying to protect him from something even more terrifying? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story full of twists and emotions, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Because sometimes the truth isn't what it seems, and some rescues are more mysterious than we could ever imagine. Wolf Face Fire Paw Prints.